the film plots or our own nation's history, there are numerous stories of freedom fighters full of passion wrestling for a cause that they truly believed in, and often one they would die for. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Life isn't worth living until you have found something worth dying for." And the Apostle Paul has some of that channeled passion of the freedom fighter in him as he contends for the truth of the gospel message. First, there are high stakes of division, and if you hadn't noticed, humans love to major on the differences, don't we? We fragment and divide so easily. We have an ability to split over the colour of the curtains or the wallpaper. We divide into vaxxers and anti-vaxxers, electric cars or oil-based vehicles, left or right, vegan or beef eating. You name it, we can divide over it. There were divisions in Paul's world too, whether it be slave or free or male or women, but most striking for Paul's world was this battle lines of the Jew versus the Gentile. You see, Paul had been commissioned to preach to the Gentiles, but he was concerned that there was a potential for a rift between the message of the Jerusalem church leaders and himself. So at the start of verse 2, he states that he set up this private meeting organised with the pillars of the Jerusalem church, and he says this, "I wanted to be sure I was not running and had not been running my race in vain." Now I want to stress, Paul is not requiring reassurance that his message is okay. So he's not going to Jerusalem to say, "Look lads, this is what I'm saying, is that okay?" He's convinced completely that the good news of the gospel that he'd been preaching and had been given to him by God alone. Tim Keller helpfully remarks, he says, "Nothing was threatening Paul's certainty, but something was threatening his fruitfulness." So what was going on? Paul talks in the passage in Galatians chapter 2, 1-10, he talks about these dangerous infiltrators or false teachers that had been tampering with the message and had been insisting that Gentile believers added circumcision and other Jewish customs in order to be fully saved. And Paul refused to tolerate any gospel plus scenarios. See, Paul was like a freedom fighter wrestling for the purity of God's message of salvation and for the freedom it consequently offers. Ultimately, Paul fears that the Jerusalem leaders may not stand up to the false teachers. Any supplement to the gospel of God rescuing sinners was intolerable to Paul. The price had been paid by Jesus in full. Any other gospel separates rather than unites. Secondly, we have Paul's motive of truth preservation. You see, I'm not arguing that Paul was this cantankerous character, angry and looking for a fight. No, he's measured and his motives are pure and godly. Look at what he says in verse 4. He says, "The matter arose because some false believers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus and to make us slaves. We did not give in to them for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you." You see, Paul knew that the message wasn't his to alter, it was God's, and he strove hard to protect it for us. He says in Romans, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and then to the Gentile." So any addition of human effort or striving to the salvation equation denies it simply of its power. And Paul knew that the salvation of God was achieved through faith in Christ alone, and that no other performance or ritual was necessary. This is good news that Paul was contending for us, and it's good news that we desperately need. We don't have to try and measure up. We can't anyway. We can get off the treadmill of performance-related acceptance from God, because it doesn't work that way. You'll never do enough. We'll never outweigh the bad. See, the gospel has swept away the merit-making religion with this radical acceptance for the undeserving. The gospel is good news because God sees us at our worst, paid the cost, and he loves us so much he offers forgiveness and new life through what Christ has done. There is freedom of joy in being accepted by God on the grounds of the work of Christ. There is joy and peace in being welcomed into his family when we don't deserve it. Paul was upset when these false teachers insisted on adding elements of earning our own salvation, as if it depended on us. Paul says that corrupts God's message of life and it enslaves us again. He's fighting hard to protect and preserve the message that from being tampered with and altered. He's fighting to enhance our freedom as God intends. And then finally, one unchanging gospel brings welcome harmony. See, the big question for Paul was, would the pillars of Jerusalem endorse his gospel, or would they attempt to add to it or modify it? These were the big hitters, remember. This was James, the brother of Jesus. This was Peter, Jesus' right-hand man, and John, also part of the inner circle of Jesus' disciples. In fact, between all of those, Paul and those three of the Jerusalem church, nearly all the New Testament had been written by them. So along with Barnabas, the Jewish encourager, Paul brought to the private meeting a real-life Gentile in Titus, and he would watch their faces to see if anyone flinched. He would know very quickly if there was a different gospel message they were operating under. Verse 3 says, "Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek." To Paul's delight, they welcomed him, including Titus, as genuine believers and colleagues of the gospel work they'd been called to. Titus, this uncircumcised Gentile Greek, had believed in Jesus. He'd been accepted by God in Christ, and Paul said that was enough. And they added nothing to Paul's message, because it was the same message. There was a consensus between them. There was an appreciation of each other and their respective commissions, both to the Jews and to the Gentiles. An acknowledgement that God had been at work in all their ministries, both in Paul and with Peter, James and John. Tim Keller concludes, he says, "It is in Christ Jesus that we can enjoy the freedom of acceptance by God regardless of our performance, and that we can enjoy a unity which pays no attention to the country's boundaries or cultural barriers." So let us embrace Paul's passion for God's unchanging message. Let's trust in Christ alone for our salvation, and let's enjoy God's rescue and acceptance. I'm your host, Matt Tuttleby of Bundoran Bible Reflections. Have a great week.